Hello, my world history students. This is our second week of video lessons. Hopefully you've had a fun and safe and most importantly healthy holiday weekend and you're back in learning mode today. This week we're going to be talking about the Silk Road and one of the most important people, Marco.
Polo,
Did you guys hear that? It's so weird. Marco,
Polo,
Marco.
Polo.
There's someone weird in my house. All right. Anyway, so we're going to be discussing Marco Polo, the Silk Road, and China. So I know that we covered a little bit of this topic this year in world history, but I wanted to go into some greater detail about who Marco Polo was and his family and why they were so special to the Mongol Empire. All right, so when we generally think of explorers, we think of the ocean explorers as Columbus, like Magellan and Hudson. In the 13th century, ocean travel was limited. Many feared the uncharted waters beyond the sight of land. Remember, people thought the world was flat and that if you sailed across the ocean and you got to a certain point, you would just die and fall off the planet Earth. Okay, so people who would take these voyages were incredibly brave at the time because that was the thinking. All right. Many feared the uncharted waters, so overland exploration, which required significant time and resources, was the best method they knew to explore new areas. A young man from Venice gained fame after his 2-decade overland journey along the Silk Road was published. Marco Polo, born in 1254, was destined to travel. Both his father and his uncle had journeyed to China when Marco was just 6 years old. It took them 9 years to return, but they brought with them amazing stories that sparked his interest and grow a flame and build a flame in his interest in China and everything that the East represented. Growing up in the busy port city of Venice, Marco received a good education since he was from a noble family. Only the wealthy were educated during this time. While the Polo brothers were off exploring, Marco's mother died. With his father away in China, the young Polo was raised by other family members who continued his education. He spoke Italian and at least 3 other languages and knew great deal about the Bible and other classical authors of the time. When his father and uncle offered him the opportunity to journey with them on their second trip east, he eagerly agreed. Even though they couldn't secure all the gifts Mongol leader Kublai Khan wanted when they returned from their first trip, they did bring some gifts offered by the Pope. Remember, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. 2 friars even began the journey with them, but soon abandoned them. Marco played 2 important roles on the journey. First, he documented everything, from the daily life he witnessed to natural wonders such as jade-filled rivers and endless desert. His stories would prove to be very important to both the West and the East. His second role was as a member of the Khan's staff. By giving Marco a job, it entailed him to travel all across China. When the family finally returned to Venice, 24 years had passed. They found it difficult to speak Italian since they had been hearing only the Chinese language for more than 20 years. But they brought with them several of the precious objects that they had received traveling the Silk Road, and were wearing clothing that could only be found far, far in the East. It wasn't until 3 years after his return that a story was written. At the time, Marco was in charge of a ship engaged in a battle with the rivals of Genoa. As fate would have it, he was captured. It so happens that his cellmate was an author. He wasn't a historical author, however. Rusticino of Pisa was a romance author who was convinced that Marco's story should be written down. His finished book was called Livre de Maravillas del Mundo, or Book of the World's Marvels. In English, this book is known as The Travels of Marco Polo. With no printing press yet invented at this time, the book was written by hand. The account was so vivid that it proved almost unbelievable to people who read it. So soon Marco Polo's story was known as El Millone, the Million Lies. He was even called Marco Millone. Nonetheless, the book was very popular, even a bestseller, and his account of the Chinese and the exotic customs he encountered was read more like a fairy tale than a historical record. Remember, people in the West, where he came from, or Italy at the time in Europe, didn't have any contact really with the East on the Silk Road. So everything that they brought back was so foreign to them that they didn't believe Marco Polo and his account of what he encountered on the Silk Road. Not long after the book was completed, he married and had 3 daughters. Marco Polo lived to be 70 years old, which at the time would be like living to 110 in our day and time now. After his death, it was discovered that he indeed did have brought back many items from the East. Some people even today question whether the expedition even took place. They wonder why he didn't mention the Great Wall of China or the use of chopsticks. Regardless, about 50 years after his death, the book was first used to make maps of the East. So he was one of the first people from the West to travel the East and record a lot of what he saw. But it was just so fantastic and out there and outlandish to the people of the West that they almost didn't believe him. All right, so now we're going to talk about specifically what he did on his travels. Having a father and uncle who were travelers influenced Marco. At the age of 17, he eagerly agreed to follow them and made their way to China. But their journey with Marco was the most memorable of all of them. When the Polo brothers visited China on their first campaign, they met the great leader Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. He was very receptive to these new visitors and wished to learn more about their society or the West where they came from. Khan wanted them to return with more information and gifts. Imagine traveling more than 5,000 miles at just the age of 17 by horse, camel, or even just your own 2 feet. Remember, this was an incredible journey for Marco, but his uncle and father were making their second incredible journey. This was all new and fun for him. The Polo family traveled several routes along the famed Silk Road, so called because silks and other valuable trading goods were transported along it. The route gained fame in the 2nd century BC as Greece and China began to trade. Along the route, trading posts and markers were set up to act as locations of exchange. Various routes along the Silk Road led to ports where large amounts of goods could be brought in and sold. Spices, fruits, vegetables, tools, religious artifacts, and precious metals were exchanged here. An important byproduct was the exchange of language, religion, culture, and sciences. So that's that globalification, the Columbian exchange of ideas and information along trade routes. One commodity that forever changed Europe and the rest of the world was something that would revolutionize warfare: gunpowder. Discovered almost by accident in the mid-9th century, gunpowder was used by the Chinese in battles. With the trade route flourishing, Chinese merchants saw a quick way to get significant value from their discovery. Europeans quickly learned its formula, and within a few years had already developed cannons fueled by gunpowder. It took the Polo family more than 3 years to reach China over land, stopping for extended periods along the way. They would have made it faster if they had sailed from the port at Hormuz. But the only ships available were in very poor shape, so they continued overland. Marco describes seeing the precious stone jade in the rivers, the immense work performed by Mongol women, and the laziness of their men. But it was Marco's description of Kublai Khan and his kingdom that people found most fascinating. He was amazed by Khan's summer palaces in the capital city, which is now part of Beijing. Marco describes the gold and silver walls of the palace and a hall so large it could easily hold 6,000 people. The Chinese, he discovered, used paper currency and had been using coal as a source of fuel for centuries. Common citizens were with paper currency could buy paper books and rice wine. Kublai Khan took a liking to the young man and made Marco part of his staff. For a while, he was even a tax collector for the Mongols. His position allowed for further exploration. He found a city much like Venice with canals along beautiful lakes. In fact, the Khan liked the Polos so much, he wouldn't let them leave. They finally convinced him they should be allowed to leave by promising to take Mongol princess to her wedding in Persia. Tricky. The trio returned to Europe after 24 years with amazing stories and wealth of goods and jewels. He brought back the compass, paper, and paper currency, silk, ivory, and jade, along with the desire for Europeans to now trade with the East. So once Europeans in the West found out about all the great Chinese artifacts, about their technology, about their culture, we wanted it for ourselves. So Marco Polo kind of opened up the East to trade with the West. All right, so I know we talked a little bit about sericulture and how the East made silk, because that was their main commodity along the Silk Road was silk. So the production of silk and raising of silkworms is called sericulture, or the study of silk. Yes, silk is made from worms, specifically caterpillars of the Bombyx mori moth. The process invented in China nearly 5,000 years ago hasn't changed much over the years. Minuscule moth eggs, about the size of the head of a pin, are carefully nurtured until they hatch. The moth larvae are tiny, hungry little caterpillars that chew their way through a steady diet of mulberry leaves, growing really fast. They need to eat every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day. When the time is right, the caterpillars begin weaving, which takes about a week. That is when people take over. The cocoons are placed in boiling water, which allows them to be deconstructed into one continuous thread that measures about 1 kilometer long. Human weavers now practice their skill. Several single threads are twisted together to make one strong thread, which is then wound into reels for weaving. Large looms of pure silk threads are then used to weave the much sought after material. Sorry, guys. Silk had made its way early on, but the secret to how it was used did not. This expensive material was only available to the rich and to members of the church, but was sought after by millions because of its soft, breathable, shiny quality. Annually, it is estimated that 10 billion silkworm cocoons are harvested for the silk industry. China leads the world in silk production with about 50,000 tons, followed by India. The two largest consumers or buyers of silk products are the nations of Japan and India. Traditional Japanese kimonos, so like what the geisha wear, their outfits, are made of silk, as are fancy saris in India as well. Silk suits, shirts, skirts, and sheets are also popular in the United States. I have a silk pillowcase, so I guess I am fancy as well. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how Marco Polo was allowed to travel on the Silk Road. Because essentially him and his father and his uncle were strangers in the East. So how did they pass without being attacked by anybody? Well, they had the key to the empire given to them. So on their initial trip to China, the Polo brothers were given a key that unlocked just about every door on their journey. This key was called a piazza, and it didn't fit in a lock. It was a golden tablet believed to be about a foot long and 3 inches wide. Excuse me. 2 years after they returned from their first journey, the Polo brothers left for China again, this time with 17-year-old Marco Polo with him and the piazza. The tablet offered the travelers protection. An inscription written upon it promised death to any who did not obey it. It also served as an all-access pass that gave them the royal treatment. Horses, camels, lodging guides, and food were at their disposal. So this was basically like a gold plaque that they were shown or that they would show to any strangers on the Silk Road or anyone whose help they needed. And it was just kind of like a seal of the king or kind of like a presidential seal where if you showed that to anyone in the East, they would want to help you. They knew that they could help you and that you were someone that they were allowed to help. You weren't a stranger in that sense. So they had the key to the kingdom and they were able to travel safely on the Silk Road and get back home eventually as well. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this mini lesson on the Mongols and Marco Polo specifically. And now you know where that game comes from, Marco Polo, right? All right, so here are the questions for this week. I'm going to put them up on the screen, and so you can take out your social studies notebook and you can write them down in there, and you'll be able to show me your answers on our Zoom meeting Monday morning at 9:30. So here we go. So if you paid attention, you should be able to answer these 3 questions. Okay, you can pause the video here, write them down. Okay. And I look forward to seeing your answers Monday morning. So the Monday morning is only for academic questions or to show me answers. Please come if you have questions or answers you want to discuss. Otherwise, the social time to get on and hang out with your friends is going to be at 12:30. All right, I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.